Truth, Lies, and History is the subtitle of Erna Paris' sixth book called Long Shadows. And it seemed to me an appropriate follow on Margaret Macmillan's talk. In the book, Erna travels across 4 continents to conduct a difficult examination into war and memory, trying to understand how nations come to terms with the most painful parts of their history. It's tough stuff, it's necessary stuff, Erna. I'm going to lead you over the same. Just dress your jacket there.
Oh, thank you. I have to say that this is the first time in about at least 15 years that I've addressed any audience without a written text. And these people are terrible taskmasters, I must say. So if I collapse with stage fright up here, I expect Moses to come and catch me before I hit the floor. Is that okay, Moses? Good. I'm going to start with a small confession, I guess my second one. And that is that I had actually written 5 books before I came to understand in some way that I was, in effect, dealing with a larger subject, that each of my books was a kind of take on a much bigger theme that I had never quite put together. Hannah Arendt once said that the luckiest writers are those who discover a subject that is worthy of a life. And I came to think, maybe I have a subject. I'm still not totally sure what it is by definition, but I have some ideas. And it has to do with the way majorities and minorities live together. It has to do with what happens to make people who may have lived happily for centuries in the same place suddenly discover that they are no longer friends, but enemies. It has to do with trying to understand what the triggers are that make that happen, what the process is over a long period of time, or sometimes a very short period of time, how the political consensus changes in a country, and how the leaders of the country can use particular weapons, if you wish, or instruments to create this change through propaganda. I think when I think back on this, where does this come from? Still not entirely sure, but I suspect it comes from the Holocaust. Not that I was affected in any direct way. My family has been in Canada since the end of the 19th century. But I learned about the Holocaust as a child of 14. I remember the day, Holy Blossom Temple. The teacher, the principal, Mr. Warschauer, pulled up his sleeve and showed us the numbers on his arm. And I don't think any of us ever talked about it, those of us who were in the class that day. But it left a very strong impression on me. I went home and wrote a heroic poem about girls my age who killed themselves rather than face whatever it is they were going to have to face. But then, like any teenager, I put it in a drawer. I forgot about the whole thing, sort of. And it wasn't until I went to France in the 1960s as a young student that this began to revive. And what happened there was that, totally by chance, I happened to visit a death camp in the Vosges Mountains. When I say by chance, I mean that. I thought I was going on a little school expedition to some sort of camp. Nobody in those days talked about the Holocaust, especially in France. And this camp, to this day, is barely known to have been a death camp. It isn't discussed in any of the major histories, such as Raoul Hilberg. I was traumatized by that experience, needless to say. And what it led to was a deep, deep curiosity about historical memory. Because in France in those days, nobody talked about what had happened to the Jews who had died in that camp. I came to learn that tens of thousands of people had died. And yet the French, it was as though such people never existed. The only thing they talked about in those days, and until very recently, as some of you may know, was the French resistance, which was the myth, the national myth that had been created at the end of the war. Margaret talked about forging history. Well, the French and many other countries forged their history. I wrote some other books, I'm not going to plug them here, on this large subject I'm talking to you about, including one on medieval Spain, tracing how the most tolerant society in medieval Europe became over 5 centuries the least tolerant with the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion. In those days it took 500 years, now it takes, of course, a lot less time. But it wasn't until I started to write this book, Long Shadows, Truth, Lies, and History, that I decided to confront my subject directly. And it happened quite, again, accidentally. I'd been invited to Japan for unrelated reasons, and I thought, well, while I'm there, I'm going to go down to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and see if I can talk to some people about how the survivors, about how they saw that seminal moment in their history and in Japan's history 50 years later. I did that. I met some extraordinary people. But what I was most struck by during that visit were the museums that I went to, the museums in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Because the story of the nuclear bombings was presented in the museums without a context. It was as though there was nothing but the terrible suffering of what had happened, but there was no war. And most of all, there were no Japanese war crimes, that's for sure. Nothing about the infamous rape of Nanking in 1937, where in a period of 2 weeks, about 250,000 Chinese were destroyed in the most appalling ways, and nothing about the research that was done by Japanese medical scientists on biological warfare on living prisoners, especially in Manchuria. Well, surprise, surprise, Freud says there are no surprises. I found myself in the territory of my subject. I hadn't been looking for it. And I thought, perhaps I can take this idea of what I'm discovering here in Japan and do something bigger. Maybe I can look at the major events of the 20th century and look at the way nations have created their history after times of crisis. Now, I knew I could have looked at any number of countries that create myths about, because most countries create a myth of nationalism. I mean, we have our own myths here in Canada. So I thought I'd look at the themes that were, in my opinion anyway, most important to the century. And I started with what I felt to be the unassimilated history of World War II. And I looked at the 3 countries that were on the wrong side of that war: Japan, Germany, of course, and France. France was an occupied country, but France also had an elected collaborationist government, the Vichy government, that was more than happy to do its share of the deportations. So that was one part of the book. I went to South Africa to look at the transition between a racist apartheid government and an inclusive democracy by means of something called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I went to the United States because I had long been fascinated, since the days when I was a kid and the civil rights movement was going on, with the legacy of slavery in that country. It seemed to me, and this was confirmed, I think, by my own research, that the United States had never properly come to terms the way it needed to do with this episode in its history, and that the consequences of having failed to do so are still visible to anyone who cares to look. I looked at ex-Yugoslavia because, as Margaret was mentioned, that is a country that abused history in the most blatant way by taking, in one instance, a battle that occurred in the 14th century and using it as the motor for a war for Greater Serbia. I mean, the Serbs did this. Of course, totalitarian societies, history in a totalitarian society is whatever the great leader says it is. We know this. So there was a tradition of this in ex-Yugoslavia, as in other communist countries. And I always remember the wonderful comment of one of the dissidents, I forget his name right now, who said the hardest thing about being a communist is learning how to predict the past. And the final subject that I explored was that of justice. And what I was interested in trying to understand was whether war crimes tribunals or justice in any kind of broad sense was useful in helping countries get over these periods of crisis and effecting reconciliation. So I traveled, as Moses mentioned, I traveled by myself. I didn't have a television crew. I didn't have a researcher. I didn't have anyone. I went by myself, and sometimes I found myself in rather dangerous circumstances, as I've written about in the book, especially in South Africa, which is one of the most dangerous countries in the world. I remember I was traveling with a cell phone because I was moving around so much I couldn't have a phone anywhere else, and I used to just clutch it like this day and night. And one day I said to myself, if someone attacks me, what am I going to do? Excuse me, 911. My family would call me from Canada, and they'd say, where are you? And I'd say, well, you don't really want to know. I also talked to everyone I could. The usual suspects, journalists always talk to, politicians, people running institutes, and so on and so forth. But I was mainly interested in talking to ordinary people, to people who had been either victims of what had happened or perpetrators. Because what I was trying to do was to build the big story from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And so I did. I talked to perpetrators, particularly in South Africa, members of the security police, about what they had done and how they felt about it now that their world had been turned upside down and changed, and this was no longer an acceptable thing to have done. I mean, because at the time it was. And I talked to many people, many victims. As we know, the black South Africans were really not treated as human beings. And for the first time in the TRC, people were allowed to say publicly what had happened to them. And this did have a cathartic effect on them. I also talked to the children of perpetrators in Germany. I talked to Martin Bormann Jr., who became a Catholic priest and devoted his life to teaching students about the Holocaust. And I spoke to Nicholas Frank, a journalist for Stern magazine, the son of Hans Frank, the Governor General for occupied Poland. I found enormous suffering among the second generation of Germans, third generation as well, and particularly among these children of major Nazis. In fact, I felt that Hans Frank was a man who barely kept himself alive, barely kept himself from committing suicide. And because I'm going to be followed here by a Klezmer Band, I'm just going to tell you a quick little anecdote about the second generation. I happened to be in a little church one day that had a Jewish museum. There were Jewish museums all over, and they were very, very strange, I have to say, all over Germany. And Klezmer bands, too. Klezmer bands, which were not German in origin, they're from Eastern Europe, and I couldn't figure out why there were so many of them, but there's a strange and a kind of neurotic interest in things Jewish in Germany, to tell you the truth. And I was in this church, and the audience was filled with middle-aged people, second generation. Klezmer Band came out, and they were singing in Yiddish, and Yiddish is so close to German that people understood. And one of the singers was singing about a very sad Yiddish song about a little boy who was going to grow up, and his mother is crooning to him, be a good boy and grow up to be a fine man, so on and so forth. And you could feel what was happening in that audience, because everyone in that audience knew that that child never did grow up. And I looked around, and people were sobbing. I was absolutely astonished. And this just goes to tell you, just to emphasize what I'm saying about the continued suffering in German society, in spite of the fact that Germany has done a great deal, more than any of the countries I studied, to try to make amends. What I found everywhere when I talked to people who had been left out of the national narrative after the event, the reconstructed narrative of the past, what I found everywhere was a sense of thwarted justice, that what had happened to them had not been acknowledged or recognized. And this, it didn't matter how many generations had passed, this was carried down through the families, and each generation picked it up from the other. Enormous anger, and a sense that, to me, that justice was and is essential to the kind of transition after periods of strife and to reconciliation. So, what is justice? Big question. Socrates asked it, and I don't claim to have any answers of a major sort. But what I can say is that in the context of what I'm talking about, I think that there are certain elements to what I'm calling justice that must be there if a transition from the past to the present to the future is to be successful. The first is that factual truth about what happened during the period in question, during the crisis, has to become available. Often when history is being reconstructed or forged, the facts go by the way. This happened in France as a myth about an all-heroic resistance was developed, and it took 40 years before the truth finally emerged. And I should say in passing, the truth always emerges eventually. It may take a half a century, but it does come out. So a basis is factual truth, the creation of an authentic historical record. Well, how do you do this in the aftermath of a crisis? You can open up secret files the way the Stasi did, but some of you, I'm sure, will know what they found in those files, letters written by husbands against their wives, wives against their husbands, people telling sexual tales on each other. I mean, stuff that really, vindictive stuff that wasn't terribly useful, I think, for the reconstruction of the historical record. You can use a truth commission, which is useful. A truth commission in South Africa, for instance, the people were advised to come and confess, it was kind of a religious thesis, confess what they had done, and then if the reasons were considered adequate, they might be amnestied. But if they didn't come forward, they faced the possibility of being tried in the regular criminal system. The problem with the Truth Commission is that there's no cross-examination of the evidence that's being presented. So again, it's good, but it's not perfect. What a Truth Commission does do, and what the one in South Africa did, was to allow people to understand the structure of the apartheid era. And I can't stress this enough, this idea of structure. Because when people are living in a situation where there's secrecy in the case of a totalitarian government, or where there's the chaos of war, they can't see past their noses. And so it is necessary to understand the facts, that the structure become apparent, and the structure will become apparent through evidence. The third way of creating facts is criminal trials, and I think they're the best. They're difficult, they're slow, they're expensive, but they're the best because the kind of facts that are going to come out of them are the most useful. You have examination, you have cross-examination, you have the fairness of due process. And I think the most interesting and important trial of this sort that we saw in the 20th century was, of course, Nuremberg. Nuremberg had mountains of evidence. And although there was a denial movement that emerged, it was not a responsible denial movement. It has remained marginal. And the reason for that is that there was no denying what happened during the Second World War. There was no responsible denial of the Holocaust after Nuremberg. And that is the reason that Germany was able to move on, because nobody could deny it. They weren't happy about it. They're still not. It may take generations before Germans are able to come to terms with this. It is not easy to be a German in the aftermath of World War II. However, Nuremberg did create a clarity for the rest of the world and for Germans themselves. It also gave the structure of the Nazi era. Well, I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to say briefly that the other main focus is the struggle against impunity. Because impunity, when crimes are not acknowledged, when the criminals continue to walk the street after the event, is the most corrosive thing that can endure in any society, and it destroys the people. It destroys the people in it. The victims have to be recognized. So I'm going to stop there. There are obviously no magic solutions, but ascertaining the facts, establishing accountability are basic to the enterprise of this transition from crisis, war, whatever it is, to peace on the other side. Thanks very much.